Russia warns the West in the fight over midterm messaging.
I called it genocide because it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian.
President Biden raises the stakes, calling out Russia for its brutal slaughter of Ukrainian civilians.
Ukraine needs weapon supplies, anything to repel Russian forces and stop their war crimes.
President Zelensky pleads for even more weapons from Western allies as Russian forces prepare for a major assault on eastern Ukraine. Plus,
I'm doing everything within my power by executive orders to bring down the price and address the Putin price hike.
President Biden takes his message to key states while inflation hits a new 40-year high.
If Joe Biden keeps shipping illegal immigrants into our states, we all gonna have to learn Spanish. My message to Biden, no way, Jose.
And ahead of the midterms, Republicans double down on culture wars. Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is now entering its 8th week, and the fallout over the atrocities committed by Russia's military against civilians has reached new levels. This week, President Biden, for the first time, called the actions of Russian President Putin a, quote, genocide. On Wednesday, President Biden announced an additional $800 million in new military supplies to Ukraine, including heavy artillery and helicopters.
All of them are designed to help Ukraine, as we talked about, help Ukraine in the fight that they are in right now, and the fight that they will be in coming days and weeks.
That comes as Russia warned that U.S. and NATO shipments of weapons to Ukraine could bring, quote, unpredictable consequences. Meanwhile, in a dramatic new step, European Union officials are drafting a proposed ban on Russian oil products, though no agreement has been reached yet on the issue. Still, President Putin rejected the idea that Russia can be cut off from the world economy.
We are not going to be isolated. No one can be isolated in the modern world. Moreover, it's impossible to do with a country as huge as Russia.
Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for The New York Times, Eugene Daniels, White House Correspondent and co-author of Politico's Playbook, and Marianna Sotomayor, Congressional Reporter for The Washington Post. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Peter, I want to start with you. You were a Moscow bureau chief for a long time. We now saw, of course, that the big news is that President Biden changed his language and for the first time called what's happening in Ukraine a genocide. Take us inside the decision to change his language here, and what impact, if any, could it have?
Well, the important thing to remember here is a political statement rather than a legal statement, right? So President Biden is saying that in his opinion, this counts as a genocide. It's not a legal determination. There is a whole set of international law here that, you know, lawyers will apply at some point or another. And there's some debate about whether this would qualify. Genocide, in theory, according to the law, would be, you know, wiping out or trying to wipe out an entire people. You could debate whether that's really what Vladimir Putin's goal is here. But it's certainly true that Vladimir's goal is to wipe out the idea of Ukraine as a separate nation and the idea of Ukrainians as separate people. That is a broader sense or definition, in a way, of genocide that we've traditionally talked about. You've seen him talk about that in public. He wrote a piece that was published last year saying that Ukraine is not a separate nation. He wrote it's simply a part of Russia and they shouldn't get, they shouldn't get status of being their own people. So in that sense, he's trying to wipe out the very idea of it. Now, what he's doing, of course, President Biden is escalating the rhetoric, whether you call it genocide or war, crimes against humanity or what have you. He's putting Putin on notice that there will be accountability when this is over. Now, we don't know how that accountability could actually take place. It doesn't look like you could send a squad of international cops to Moscow and arrest Vladimir Putin and put him up in the dock. But there is this idea that, Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular will have to be held accountable for the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine these last few weeks.
And Eugene, Peter's talking about escalating rhetoric. There was also, of course, increasing aid this week. How much of this language change and this wanting to call it a genocide do we think influenced the idea and the decision by President Biden to send more aid to Ukraine as the country, of course, is continuing to plead for even more weapons?
Yeah, one of the things we've seen as this conflict, this invasion has continued, is you start to see President Biden kind of getting ahead of where, in his language, the administration is. This is one piece of this, and when he talked about, basically kind of got to get rid of Vladimir Putin, they have made it clear, the administration, that these are not changes in the way that they are viewing it, no change in policy. But it does show you that as he gets more frustrated, we will continue as a country to give more aid to Ukraine, more military assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainians. And so that's what Ukraine, Vladimir and Zelensky want to see. And they've talked about that, is that wanting to make sure that America continues to keep the coalition of European countries and NATO together to continue to put pressure on Russia. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and we saw Vladimir Putin there talking about not being able to be cut off. He's also been surprised, Vladimir Putin and Russia writ large, about the resilience of Ukraine, the amount of assistance that's been given from both the United States and European countries. So as this continues, and it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon, every official I talk to here in the United States says that is going to continue to up. Right? Every time that it looks like it's going to get worse, we're going to continue to give every kind of aid that we can without increasing the dangers for Americans and NATO.
And Marianna, Eugene's talking about this sort of prolonged war and this going, of course, much longer than a lot of officials thought it would go. I wonder, of course, Congress was out this week, but I know that that's your beat. So I want to ask you, what's going on in terms of Congress, where lawmakers' minds are when it comes to what to do next? And is there sort of bipartisan agreement on the way forward?
The fact that this is going to go on for a long time is exactly what's at the forefront of their minds. Right now, they're not necessarily talking about how much money they should be sending over to Ukraine. They already did that in an aid package last month, but they are starting to think that at some point they're going to have to do that again. And what that looks like is probably going to start to be under discussion when they come back into session at the end of this month into next month. And that, of course, can look like funding for military equipment. That is something big that you all previewed earlier, where Zelensky has been really making that plea, not to mention the fact that they need the humanitarian aid as well. Zelensky has done a really good job anytime he has briefed lawmakers to really make an emotional appeal. And that has really, as we've seen in the last couple months, really triggered members into action. And it's very rare nowadays to see anything pass in a bipartisan manner or have overwhelming support. And you really see that here on this issue. So it's likely that more things will come up as this issue continues to be at the forefront.
And Peter, as Marianna is talking about the thinking of lawmakers, I want to come to you as our Russia expert to talk about the thinking possibly of President Putin. We see Russian military forces regrouping. Just this week, we saw an important Russian warship sink. Russia is saying that it was an accidental fire. Ukraine is saying that they hit the ship with missiles. But overall, what do we think of, or what do we know about President Putin's thinking of the overall war as a possible miscalculation?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't know what's in his head. That's part of the problem here, of course. But it has been, a serious miscalculation on every front. There's no other way to look at it. They thought they could simply waltz into Ukraine and within a few days and weeks have it all wrapped up. They literally thought, and we reported this, that 30 to 50% of the Ukrainian army would simply switch sides, simply join the Russians and say, yes, we're on your side. Didn't happen, obviously. They thought that they could drive a wedge within the West. In fact, it's been the opposite. NATO is more unified today than obviously has been in years. They thought that they could drive the United States and the West out of Eastern Europe, or at least send a signal that they should get out. Instead, you're now seeing Finland and Sweden, who never joined NATO during the Cold War, didn't see the need to do it then, now talking about joining NATO now. So on every front, Vladimir Putin has succeeded in doing the opposite of what he says he wanted to do. Now they are regrouping, as you say. They seem to be focusing more on the East, looking for some sort of way of getting a win out of this. If they can carve off part of Ukraine in the East and say, well, this is the part where Russian speakers live the most, and therefore we're going to focus on that. That may be his next, plan B at this point. Ukraine obviously won't accept that. President Zelensky has made clear that Ukrainian territory is Ukrainian territory. It was bad enough that they have had to live for 8 years with Russians effectively seizing control of both Crimea and the eastern Donbass area. They're not going to accept a larger share of their territory being permanently occupied. And if that's what President Putin thinks is going to happen, he's going to probably be in for many years of fighting to come, whether it be on a formal battlefield or just in sort of a kind of guerrilla resistance. So he has, I think, put himself and his country in a place that is unenviable and without an easy out.
Unenviable is definitely a way to put it when you think about sort of Russia's stance here and their position. Eugene, I want to come to you because it's these atrocities that we continue to learn about are just heartbreaking. Just this week, we saw that the bodies of 900, more than 900 civilians were found in areas right outside Ukraine's capital. I wonder, when you think about it, as this war deepens, what's the Biden administration's thinking when it comes to possibly sending an administration official over there to be on the ground in Ukraine?
Yeah, one of the things that my colleagues at Politico scooped this week was that the administration was having internal discussions about sending a high-level official to Kiev to kind of show further support, right, for Ukraine, kind of upping the amount of face time that we have been giving to Ukraine, right? Who that is very unclear. But when you talk about high-level officials who make sense, you have obviously President Biden, though Jen Psaki yesterday at an event said that they were not sending President Biden to Ukraine. But you also have Vice President Kamala Harris, who was in Poland and Romania recently. You have Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the Secretary of State. So all of them seem like people who make a lot of sense. If they are going to send folks, they're probably not going to tell many people when that, if they do pull the trigger on that. And what we're told is that that could also change depending on how the war continues to play out, how dangerous it is, or how safe it can be made for our high-level officials. I will say the administration does feel pressure, external pressure, when you watch Boris Johnson walk the streets of Kiev with Zelensky, when you see the EU commissioner there as well, to do more and to say, okay, stick their foot on the soil and see firsthand what we've been seeing in pictures and videos ever since. Because as this war continues, one thing that administration officials have been thinking a lot about is how do we keep the coalition together? And one of those ways is continuing to show extreme support, continuing to show that you're willing to do more than you were doing before. And this would certainly be an escalation when it comes to symbolism in this invasion.
And Marianna, what's Congress thinking about what they can do to do more? When you hear Eugene thinking about sort of what the White House thinking is here, what are lawmakers talking about? How can they sort of make this even more painful for Russia?
Well, to that exact point, Congresswoman Sparks, she is a Republican from Indiana. She was also born and raised in Ukraine. She has been asking the administration, writing letters to them to send someone to be a point of contact in Ukraine. So that is something that she's been unilaterally trying to do. But in terms of what other things Congress has been talking about, what they could help in the short term, are two different things. One, the Senate has actually already passed just kind of this procedural legislation that would help ease and streamline any arms shipments that the U.S. may want to send to Ukraine. That's now something that the House may consider in these upcoming weeks when they're back in session. Something else that Democrats in particular, both in the Senate and in the House, have been talking about, some have introduced legislation on, is how can they undo some tax breaks for American companies that are still doing business with Russia. They're trying to find other ways to hurt Russia, even though Vladimir Putin has said, any sanctions, any economic setbacks aren't really being felt here. The United States is still trying, and Congress in particular, trying to be ahead and trying to find those ways to hurt Putin and Russia where it could hurt.
And Peter, I want to come to you because there's also, of course, this news of European Union officials looking at a possibly drafting a proposal to ban Russian oil. How significant of a development is this?
Well, if they follow through on it, it would be significant, obviously, because Russia sells a lot of its energy to Europe, and Europe depends on Russia. And they've been very reluctant to cut them off entirely because, in fact, they would pay a price. You know, it's easy for politicians in Washington to say, let's cut off Russian oil here. We don't depend on it. We're not going to have our lights go off and have our homes cold at night if we cut off Russian energy the way Europe does. So if they actually follow through on it, it's a big deal. It's a big economic pain for Russia, because that's where they get a lot of their income from overseas. But obviously it involves pain on the part of the Europeans, and they're looking for ways to mitigate that through other sources of energy. That's something that Washington has talked to them about. The Biden administration has tried to find ways to help them substitute energy for what they would lose if they did it. It would be a huge statement and potentially a big economic penalty for Russia.
And Peter, in the last couple seconds before we go into the domestic politics, because there's a lot to talk about there, I just want to ask you really quickly about this sort of reporting on Ukraine as a sort of IT war. They have a defense minister that's working with social media influencers to really tell the story of the war, to be on social media, keeping it front of mind to people. And one report even described Ukraine as a sort of tech company and Russia as an old rusty tank. What can you tell us about the different strategies here?
Yeah, no question that Ukraine has been a case study in the modern form of warfare. Beyond the bombs and guns, is an online war going on in which Ukraine is fighting for the hearts and souls of the world. And their digital minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, has managed to use Twitter, just as an example, to shame companies and to stop doing business with Russia, to appeal to companies around the world for help to Ukraine. They've literally sent out, I think, thousands of businesses have contacted in order to seek help or to try to get them to cut off Russia. They've used that sort of platform to bring their case around. Obviously, the videos that they can post, the president's Zelensky's ability to talk to the world through Zoom, through video contacts. That's so different than what we saw the last time Europe had a war in the 90s when the Balkans flared up, and it really brings that war home to people's living rooms, and I think help Ukraine basically make their case against Russia. And it is surprising that Russia, which has a great deal of cyber capability, has not seemingly been able to use it to its benefit. That may be a sign of preparation that was done in advance of the war by the Ukrainians with American help, or it may be that they're holding back and that there's still, cyber power to come from Russia that we haven't seen yet.
Well, it's certainly an interesting thing that we'll want to keep talking about. Meanwhile, this week, the nation's economic challenges deepened. Inflation hit a new 40-year high. President Biden traveled to Iowa and North Carolina to talk about what his administration is doing to address rising prices.
Our economy has gone from being on the mend to being on the move. Now, I know that we're still facing challenges of high prices, inflation. We need to address these high prices, and urgently, for working folks out there.
In the meantime, many Republicans are focusing their midterm election strategy on culture wars, issues like abortion, guns, and medical care for transgender young people. Eugene, I want to come to you to talk about this strategy by President Biden, but there was some eye-popping reporting in Political Playbook. Of course, you're a co-author. I want to read it because President Biden's campaign pollster said, "This is possibly the worst political environment I've lived through in 30 years of being a political consultant." That is just striking to hear. I wonder what you are hearing from your sources about the challenges that Democrats face and their strategy for navigating them.
Yeah, I mean, they are just as concerned as John Anzalone is, right? When you talk to them, especially, on background, when you don't have to tell people their name, they'll be a lot more blunt, just as blunt as he was, because they see the same things we see. They see inflation. They talk to their family members around the country who have higher gas prices all of a sudden, and that people don't see a way out of this. But I will say Anzalone also talked about the importance of the administration, members of Congress, Democrats, in passing some form of the social spending bill that was promised, right? We have seen that stalled since last December and fits and starts throughout. And when they get back in just about a week, they're apparently going to start negotiating this more and negotiating this in earnest. And if they're able to do that, if they're able to pass some kind of bill, the hope that Democrats have is that that will help blunt some of this, right? If it's not, if they don't keep the House and the Senate, at least stem some of the bleeding, so it's not a bloodbath, and then it's not as bad as it looks right now. But when you talk to Anzalone and he's feeling that way, it does tell you how the administration's feeling, and possibly even what President Biden is hearing from folks that he talks to consistently.
I want to also ask you about what President Biden's hearing from fellow Democrats, because the Biden administration has announced that it's going to be restarting selling leases to drill oil and gas on federal lands. What's your reporting reveal about the tension here between Democrats on climate change? On the one hand, activists want to see less reliance on fossil fuels, but of course you have a White House that is just trying to make sure gas prices don't go any higher.
Yeah, the climate community is split. Like Democrats typically are on these kinds of issues. You have one camp who really understands that what President Biden is trying to do is address what they think is a short-term problem, right? Getting gas prices to a better place, especially because you have the midterms so close. But on the other hand, you have a lot of activists who say, well, wait, you promised us to work on climate change, and here we are talking about drilling more in the United States. There's a huge concern that the administration's promises on climate are not going to come to fruition because of where we are, and who knows how long this war is going to continue as the administration figures out how to blunt some of that. And when you talk about gas prices, and the administration calls it the Putin price hike, that inflation was going on before the invasion, right? And so that's something folks should remember. And one of the things that I've heard a lot from climate activists over the last week is that they're frustrated with the White House because they feel like this was an opportunity to say to the American people consistently in every single speech, this is why we need to get away from fossil fuels in this country. Look at the other ways that we can bring energy to America by focusing on other aspects of this and not focusing on oil. And they've told the administration this. And so we'll see how that plays out as we move forward.
And Marianna, there's also, of course, what's happening on the GOP side. We see Republicans passing all sorts of laws, focusing on culture wars. You talked to a Republican from Florida who's saying they're not shying away from these issues. What's the significance and the strategy here of the GOP leaning in on these culture war issues?
Yeah, when I talk to Republicans, it's pretty interesting to have them explain, okay, we are getting attacked by Democrats, sure, with how we're framing these things. For example, the Don't Say Gay legislation that Governor Ron DeSantis actually signed into law last week, that isn't good for them. And they acknowledge that. They also acknowledge that, what you actually played, that ad by Kay Ivey, the governor of Alabama, where she says, we're going to start speaking Spanish. And that's not okay. They don't like to see that kind of extremism too much because they know that that can alienate certain bases. In terms of Don't Say Gay, that could be suburban women. In terms of what Governor Ivey was saying there, that of course is the Hispanic vote, that Republicans are making inroads. However, if you explain those issues, that is where they see a lot of turnaround. In terms of that one congressman that I actually spoke to from Florida, a Republican, they were saying that when they are back home talking about that legislation, not saying that it's Don't Say Gay, but the fact that, we want to make sure that you as parents know that kids are being taught this at a very young age, from pre-K to third grade. That gets a better reception from parents. And Republicans, for the most part, have very much been looking at a number of culture issues and turning it back to the issue of choice.
And it's a strategy that has been working for them. So Eugene, I have about a couple of minutes left here. I want to try to split it with you and Peter, but I want to come to Eugene for a minute here just to talk about sort of this strategy. I was in Alabama talking to transgender children who say some of these laws are detrimental to their health. What do you make of this strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strategy, was just said, that Republicans think is going to work for them if they're able to explain it in the right way and couch it in some kind of parental rights. What are we teaching your children? But then when you actually look at the kinds of things that are being taught in schools in K through third grade, like with these Don't Say Gay bills, or not talking about gender identity in schools, kids aren't being taught that, right? It's not like kids are not being taught about sexuality. And so that is something that when you talk to parents of transgender kids, when you talk to advocates, their concern is the effect on that, the effect of having kids continue to press that within themselves when we know the rates of suicide among that community, especially for young folks, is already very high. So the concerns about how this actually plays out in the long term and short term and medium term is a big concern.
And Peter, in our last 30 seconds here, you told our producers the Democrats are in desperate straits, but we saw the president go to Iowa and North Carolina in just about 30 seconds. What can you tell us about the politics here?
Yeah, look, he has two real missions here. One is to try to do what he can to get inflation under control. Two is to be seen doing what he can to get inflation under control. The problem for a president is there are only limited tools a president has that can really impact that on a short-term basis, and that's a frustration for this administration. They don't have a lot of time left, as we just talked about with the midterms coming up. So what you need to have, or the White House feels like it needs to have, is at least an image of a president who understands the concern, is out there and trying to address them as aggressively as possible.
Yeah, well, a lot to talk about. Thank you so much, Peter, Eugene, Marianna, for joining us and for sharing your reporting. We'll continue our conversation on the Washington Week Extra. This week's topic, new text messages reveal just how far some Republicans wanted to go to overturn the 2020 election. Find it on our Facebook, on our website, and on our YouTube. And tune in on Saturday to PBS News Weekend for the latest news from Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.